Great, there we are. So thanks for the patience and the little delay while we got started. My name is Michael Witt, and I am one of the co-chairs of RDA's Data Repository Attributes Working Group, affectionately known as the DROG. And today we are celebrating the conclusion of 18 months of work on coming up with a common set of descriptive attributes for data repositories and providing some examples of how those attributes are implemented. And so just to give a little bit of an overview for the session, we'll have this little bit of a welcome. I'll take some time to give a little bit of a timeline, a little bit of history of the group and the work that we've done, and then talk about the 17 attributes themselves and do a quick rundown through them. This should be maybe 15 minutes. And then we've invited 3 speakers to come and share their experience in taking the 17 attributes and looking at their own data repositories and trying to, in a way, pretend like they're not familiar with the repository and try to see how these attributes are expressed and exposed, and to evaluate the implementation of the attributes with their data repositories as they currently are. And so we'll have 3 lightning talks. This will hopefully also serve to illustrate the attributes kind of in practice. And then at the conclusion of the lightning talks, we'll have an interactive part of the meeting. If you've participated in DROG before, you know that we're a working group, and so we do work. Even with this, our last meeting, we'll focus on adoption and implementation, and we'll have breakout groups and breakout discussions for a half-hour, small group discussions that will be facilitated by a group of leaders here in the room and online with Matt Cannon. And then we'll do report outs, and then we'll talk about the conclusion of the group and what our next steps will be. I will say, for those of you who are online, the room that we're in is not particularly well suited for breakout discussions. The chairs are fixed, and it's a huge room. I feel like this should be like a rock concert, like U2 should be playing here and not the Data Repository Attributes Working Group. But we'll make do, we'll adapt, of course. So we'll appreciate for the breakouts if people are flexible and moving around to where the breakout leaders are and doing discussions even with the chairs fixed as they are. So we'll start with our timeline for the creation of these common descriptive attributes for data repositories. So this has been 2 years in the making. The idea for this working group was first pitched as a birds of a feather back in August of 2021. Just out of curiosity for people in the audience and online, raise your hand if you were at that BOF. Okay, so I see 1 hand, 2 hands in the audience. Okay, so that was the kind of maybe the genesis. We submitted our case statement that was reviewed by the Technical Advisory Board and was approved, and we were formed then in February of 2022. Since that time, starting in March of 22, we've been meeting every month on Thursday. So 19 meetings in total to develop this work. 134 members. And in our calls, we average, between 20 and 30 kind of regulars, if you will, on the call. So other things that the working group has done over this course of time, besides the meetings and developing the work, we did, Matt Cannon and I were on the Data Streams podcast, trying to promote the work that we're doing and engage a broader audience. This was hosted by the RDA in the US. And then weirdly, our kickoff meeting was well into our timeline. Was it P19, which was online. Just out of curiosity, how many people were online on P19? So more hands going up, good. After that, we had P20, which is in Gothenburg, Sweden. This was the first draft that we shared with the community, version 0.5 of the draft. And we did this kind of interesting activity where we invited 3 people to come and criticize our draft. So I had this experience at my university of participating in a meeting of economists, and this was kind of the way that they worked, where somebody would present a paper and then 3 experts would be invited to kind of like criticize it, and all in the interest of improving the work. And then of course afterwards everyone, you know, gets a beer or gets coffee or gets lunch, and it's all very collegial. And so we had Andrew Trelaw and Jenny Larkin and Olaf Olsen as our invited critiques, who came and gave us critical feedback. And then we did some brainstorming around, you know, what's missing from the attributes, what gaps do we need to address? We also did a webinar in May of 23, celebrating the 10th anniversary of the RDA, which is wrapping up now. And then of course here today. So just out of curiosity, how many people were at P20 in Sweden? All right, so more people still. How many people are here today? All right, good. Just checking to make sure you're still with me. So we have a lot of new people here. So I want to make sure that we go ahead and briefly go over the attributes and the timeline for this. I want to back up 1 second because I forgot to mention the collaborative notes document. So if you are participating in RDA, you'll probably hear this at the beginning of every working group session, to log on to the collaborative notes document and to add your name as an attendee. So go ahead and add your name as an attendee now. This was also emailed out to the working group mailing list, and there's a QR code for it and the URL there. And then we have a few designated note takers, but many hands make for light work. So if you can jump in and add your thoughts and questions as the working group session continues, that would be terrific. All right, so let me circle back to the beginning and talk about our case statement. So back 2 years ago, when we presented this idea for a working group to the RDA, we said we would do 2 things. We would have 2 outputs, a recommendation and a supporting output. And so the recommendation is to come up with a list of common descriptive attributes of a data repository. So in other words, you know, what does a well-described repository look like? And, you know, a focus on the commonality, common ground. And so this recommendation includes a definition of each attribute, the rationale for the use and the value of the attribute. So why do we care about this attribute? The feasibility of implementation. So some attributes are more aspirational to implement. Others are very common and almost de facto. And then last, a gap analysis of each attribute based on the current state of repositories, data repositories. And so this is the recommendation, and we'll talk in more depth about that in this session, and it'll be the focus of our work in concluding it. So the recommendation you submit for community review. So in about 2 weeks, we'll submit this work. It'll go through community review, and if it's approved, it will become a formal published recommendation of the RDA. That's what the recommendation is. The second output that we proposed was a supporting output. This has a less rigorous review process, and it's meant to be in support of a recommendation. And so our supporting output in this case would be a selection of examples of data repositories that have taken different approaches to express and expose these attributes, and to both users, to human beings, and to user agents for machine interoperability. So those are the two outputs that we proposed in the case statement. One of the important activities that we engaged in was to brainstorm user stories. So who would be the stakeholders for these attributes, and what would some of the needs be that having well-described repositories help to fill? And so you could imagine, as a researcher, would want to be able to generate a list of repositories and evaluate which data repository is the best option for them to deposit their data. Or as a repository manager, I might be interested in what information I present about my data repository on my website and through machine interfaces, so that I'm adequately advertising my services and my collections. As a repository developer, as someone who's developing the software that different repository platforms use, I may want to have a better idea of how to express and serialize these attributes as structured metadata for reuse, again, by users and by user agents in a manner that's integrated into the functionality of the platform. The idea being then that every data repository that is implemented on that platform then is expressing and exposing those attributes. We've had a terrific engagement from the publisher community. Publishers are interested in authors who submit manuscripts with accompanying data and helping them choose the appropriate repository for them to deposit their data along with their manuscript, or by advising editorial boards and journals on what author guidelines to give. As a funder, you may be interested in tracking the outputs of the research that you fund and ensuring that the data management and sharing plans have been implemented by the researchers that you've given grants to. And then if you're a registry, like Re3 Data or Affairs Sharing, we'd like to be able to easily identify these attributes and index them so that users can search and find them. So these are examples of some motivational user stories. We actually developed dozens and dozens of these, and they're available in a link to the collaborative notes from our monthly meetings. And so the structure of the recommendation, we have 17 attributes, and each attribute has a label. The label is just what we're calling the attribute. A description, so this is just a short one sentence, very pithy, very concise description of what the attribute is. We provide a few examples of what the attribute is. These are not at all comprehensive. These are just to give some idea and illustrate what the attribute is. We provide references to schemata, different schemas that implement the attribute, and then a longer paragraph that's essentially a discussion or notes related to the attribute. What makes it, what the current state of the art is, what are kind of like the tricky parts of it, the parts that may be difficult to harmonize. And then a gap analysis, all the way from the attribute being easy to find, difficult to find, or not available or impossible to find. And this is work that the group did. And so for these attributes, keep four things in mind, if you will. The first is that the attributes are describing the repository. Okay, so we're at the repository level in our description, not the contents of the repository necessarily. And this is something that we went back and forth in our group, in our discussions, kind of ping-ponging back and forth in terms of the level of granularity is at the repository. The second point is that this is a conceptual model. Okay, so this is, even though it may look like a metadata schema or a format, it is not. And in fact, we're not endorsing any particular approach or any particular implementation. We reference lots of different implementations, but the idea is to kind of gather some consensus around, high-level concepts that are important to describe a data repository. The third thing is that the recommendation is meant to be concise. Okay, so it's not everything in the kitchen sink. Any one of these attributes could have a journal or its own conference, and in fact, some of them do. Okay, so with an attribute like curation, for example, it's very, very expansive. And so what we labored to do is to try to keep the descriptions of and the implementations very, very concise. And in doing this, some of the attributes may be somewhat overloaded. And this has been, part of like, where do you draw the line between, what you include and what you don't include. And then the fourth thing I'd like you to keep in mind is the emphasis on the word common, okay? Now, because something is uncommon or less common doesn't mean that it's not important, okay? So what we're trying to do is find a common ground of descriptive attributes for data repositories, something that can be implemented across different kinds of data repositories and that is doable, okay? So commonality is also key. And so this brings us to our 17 attributes. The QR code is here if you want to look at our final draft. It's a 0.9 version of the attributes. We stuck with these 17 from 0.5, and in the recommendation, I would encourage you to go and look and evaluate the work that we've done. And if you want to offer any kind of feedback, we're open to it, understanding that we're wrapping up the work here in the next couple of weeks, okay? In the interest of time, I'm not gonna go through all of the attributes. but I encourage you to go ahead and review them here while we're talking, and also to see the implementations that'll be highlighted in the lightning talks. So I think this brings us to our invited speakers. And what we want to do here is we'd like to have some of the members of our group share their experience in evaluating their data repositories and looking to see how easy these were to find in their own repositories. And I can say for myself, I used to manage our institutional data repository at Purdue. And when I sat down to do this, I was kind of humbled in a way at how difficult it was. In software development, they call it eating your own dog food, essentially. And so it was a helpful experience, and it was enlightening for me to go through. And so we have 3 speakers today to give lightning talks. We have Anu Gururaj from NIH presenting import. We have Dewerge Bloman from KU Leuven presenting their institutional data repository. And then we have a recording from Doug Fills presenting Ocean Info Hub and a schema.org implementation. And so with that, I'd like to invite Anu up.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present my experience with looking at these attributes for a repository that we manage out of NIH. So I just want to say this was done by 2 people, by myself and a data science fellow within NIAID his name's Diego Sierra. So we both looked at these attributes and how well we could find them on the import website. So just to give you a little bit of background about import, import is a public data sharing platform for immunology research. It has both all kinds of biomedical data sets, including clinical trials and other natural history studies. Import's charge is to provide curated data, reference data sets, and tools for collaboration and analysis. And this is primarily for data sets that are generated by funding from the Division of Allergy, Immunology, and Transplantation, in short called DATE, which is a division within the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases within NIH. Import's mission is to archive primary data, this primary data comes in terms of supporting research findings and to enable reproducibility and reuse of this data. So this second reuse part, as many of you probably know, is kind of hard. So import tries to harmonize and curate the data in a manner where it's easy for a downstream user to reuse the data and generate novel hypotheses. Import also has been striving to make the data fair, even before I believe the FAIR principles were published in the paper. However, just an overview of how import is FAIR compliant. I'm not going to go through all of that, but just to know that we do keep an eye on how well we are able to map to FAIR principles. This is a brief highlight of what kind of data is in import. Since import is an immunology repository, we will take in any data type that's relevant to immunology. So we are not data type specific, but we are a domain specific repository. We have close to 800 studies within import right now, and we have both human subjects and animal model studies. We have about 173 clinical trial data. That means that these are like participant level, row level data that's available for reuse within import, and there's no data use access required to get the data from import. So all you need to do is register into import, and then you're able to download the data. The data has been reused quite well, and you can see there's a couple of examples of papers that have been published reusing data from import. So this is just talking about import. I'll jump into our experience with looking for the common descriptive attributes of import. So this, as I mentioned, was performed by two individuals. One was a novice repository user. That means that they have been looking at the repository kind of in the shorter term for the past month or two. The other individual is somebody who's experienced with this repository, so knows quite well about what the repository has and does not have. So I just briefly provided summaries of the gap analysis for the various attributes. And you can see that there is a difference between how a novice user found the attributes on import versus how the experienced user found the attributes. And what was very interesting for me to see was that the way a novice user thinks about not just how to find the attributes, but about what the attributes themselves are is quite different than somebody who's a lot into data management and data repositories. And a lot of our users are actually novice users, right? They do come to the repository many times without knowing anything about the repository. So I think it's a good exercise to do for us to learn about how we present these attributes to our users. So I've also highlighted some of the major differences. There were many common ones which were easy to find, like the name, the description, things of that kind. What I've highlighted in this table is essentially just those where there were differences between the two users who did this study. One was the use of persistent identifiers. The novice user kind of indicated that they couldn't find, or it was very hard to find the persistent identifier, or the repository was not using any persistent identifier. The experienced user actually said they do. They use DOIs and study identifiers that are unique to the repository itself. But what's interesting is that after I went back to look, it is true that the repository uses DOIs, but this is not maybe obviously displayed to the user when they go to look at a specific data set. Also, you can see that machine interoperability is another aspect. The novice user just looked at APIs as an indicator of machine interoperability, whereas the experienced user took both API and schema.org markups within the repository as machine interoperability. So there are, again, differences there. The other one I want to point out is the certification. The novice user kind of took a text that described the grant information and the contract information about the repository itself as enough of a certification, possibly because it's funded out of NIH. Whereas the experienced user looked for the core trust seal repository certification that import has and thought that was a valuable certification that they need to be looking at. The preservation policy is again similar because the novice user looked at the text that's provided with the import repository, which says that import will have the data available. Doesn't indicate how long and how it's going to be kept available, but there's a declarative statement there. And the experienced user, in fact, said that it doesn't exist because there is no specific preservation policy provided on the website. So primarily the key takeaways is that immaterial of the user that's going to be looking at these attributes in a repository. It's a very useful exercise, especially for somebody like me who's a repository manager. And the focus is obviously distinctly different when it comes to repository management aspects. So it's useful to think about the fact that the users themselves probably are not very concerned about repository management, right, when they come to the website. And the other part is that it's hard to disallow for prior knowledge as one goes through these attributes. So a machine actionable implementation of this would be extremely useful. And I think that's my last slide. I just put this up, but it's kind of, too much to go through. But I do have links for these, evaluations provided on the web, in my slides. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Anu. Next, we'll have up Dewerja. With apologies for mispronouncing your name again.
So my name is Diewertje Bloemen, but I'm very used to people mispronouncing that. So I'm actually not going to tell you a lot about my repository that I'm discussing beforehand, because I hope the repositories do the work for me. And so we'll just dive right in. So each of the, the attributes, describe it for me, sorry. I've just gone through all the attributes, and I've indicated if I found the information on the repository platform or in the documentation itself. Now, something to point out, I'm the repository manager, but I was one of the staff members that helped write the manual. So it was maybe a bit easy for me to find some of this information, but I was very strict. If I didn't find it literally there, and if it was just because I knew it, then I didn't include it. And I thought that was going to be really easy. And then I stumbled upon the first one, and I realized, oh, we actually have two names, and they're used interchangeably across our platform. We have our short name, which is the official one, but we continuously write it in full. So even I can't say, according to the repository and the documentation, what the name really is, but it is Guy Leuven Radar, RDA. The URI is implicit, as it is for most repositories. The country is Belgium, though nowhere described, but it can be derived from the fact that Guy Leuven is the biggest university there, and also because the URL ends in DE. The language, implicitly, it's in English because the entire platform is in English. But in the documentation, it is stated that all the metadata's primary fields need to be in English. So it is in there if they want to add it in Dutch, which is our native tongue, then they need to duplicate the field and add in a secondary description, for example. The institution was also pretty straightforward because everything was branded in the institution's name. For the contact, it was pretty straightforward because we use a Dataverse software. We have the contact button that all Dataverses have, and there was always the support link to our help desk from the documentation pages. So that was pretty logical. And then the description was another one that I realized, oh, we have two. One was in the documentation, one was on the repositories platform. I've used the one in the documentation because that's going to be the one that I assume people think is the official one, because it's really the about page of the repository. And there you can see that we're Dataverse based, that we're an institutional repository open for all publication, all data from research at the university. And that was also the next question, sort of what was the research area? The only thing that was stated in the documentation was that any Guy Leuven research data was welcome. So I think that's enough. Persistent identifiers were easy to find because it's one of the things that we have been trying to use as a lure to get people to actually publish their data and say, you get a DOI for it. So it's pretty well documented, and it's also visible on the data sets themselves. Then for the machine interoperability, I realized that it's not very well documented, but it is findable if you keep browsing enough. We have a lot of documentation pages, which is one of the takeaways that I took away from this exercise. But we also link to just the software guide of Dataverse, which does describe the machine interoperability really well. So that's what I put in for everything to do with metadata harvesting and such. The API is documented in our own documentation pages, as well as an integration dashboard that we use for data into sort of transferring between different platforms. For metadata, we luckily have a metadata librarian on our support team. So that was quite well documented because we have our entire metadata model described in detail. And we also refer back to the Dataverse documentation, which describes with what standards it all conforms. Curation phase was also very clearly present because we have an entire tab of our documentation called review, because we have reviews. Then the terms of deposit were parts of the terms of use. The same for the terms of access, basically. And then the licenses were also quite well documented because we just have a documentation page on licenses. You'll see that we have a lot of separate documentation pages, which wasn't easy. Well, for me it was, because I knew they all existed, but it was quite difficult, I realized, to find them if you weren't aware that they were out there. For certification, currently none, but I knew that we are actually working on it. And it's also in our roadmap. So I knew it was hidden somewhere in our documentation, so I slipped it in there. And kind of the same for the preservation policy. There's currently none because it's still sort of high up at the university to get the stamp of approval. So that's why it's been pending for a while now. Although in the frequently asked questions, there is a mention of the 10-year preservation period at minimum, but that's of course not a full policy. Now, from going through all these attributes relatively quickly, because I knew where the information could be found, I had a couple of takeaways. So the first thing I've already mentioned, there are sometimes multiple values available for the same attribute, which wasn't a great thing to realize about your own documentation. Also that some information just wasn't openly available. I knew it exists, but it wasn't findable for others, so I described it as not available or not there. For example, the preservation policy. But also what I really realized that this information is not findable in one place. It's scattered all over. I think in total we have about 23 documentation pages. We don't have a search bar, which would have helped a lot. And just going through all those pages would have been very unrealistic to expect from a researcher. I could do it because I knew exactly on what page I could find what information, and I could do a control find to get there. But it wouldn't have been realistic to expect that from anyone else who wasn't working on the project. And that's also my second point. Yeah, the documentation was plentiful, but that was an impediment instead of sort of helpful along the way, because it was really difficult to find the core information. And because it is so plentiful, there was also a higher likelihood of duplication of information that differs slightly, because there are so many pages that you filled up over time that sometimes you started to repeat certain attributes, but they're not exactly the same. Or in the case of the description, I know that I updated it on the about page, but I apparently didn't update it somewhere else. So that was really something I realized that could have been improved on our documentation, and kind of the attributes are going to help me to hopefully improve that, and by adding a search bar as well. So yeah, that was my part. So yeah, thank you.
Then up in the booth, if you could cue Doug Phil's video, please. So Doug was not able to join us in person, but recorded his talk on Ocean Info Hub and a schema.org implementation.
Hello, my name is Doug Bills, and thank you for the opportunity to present in this session. I really just want to talk a little bit about the working group recommendations and some experiences and feedback on how they might be implemented and leveraged inside an environment like what Ocean Info Hub is creating. So first, let me just set the stage. And for this group, this is probably not necessary, but we all know that data volume is increasing, that even the basics of finding have not really been solved, and that there is, in addition to that, still pressure from funding agencies and government agencies and regulating agencies to push for open data and fair data for addressing a range of intentions from those organizations. In that context, Ocean Info Hub is actually a project that is working with a set of international partners for the collection of ocean-related data. I'll talk just a little bit about that in a little bit. But among the patterns that Ocean Info Hub is working with, which is a range, right? We deal with data set documents, regular documents, coursework, people, organizations, vessels, things like this. The concept of institutions is in there, and some of our institutions, in fact, would be data repositories. And so the recommendations from this working group then are of interest to us in that regards. I will just note that as a contractor, this is not an official stance by Ocean Info Hub. It's something that we're looking at implementing and will be part of our discussions going forward. So just to give a quick context, then Ocean Info Hub is a project of the Ocean Data 2030 work. We have some of the provenance information there in the lower right, so you can see the organizations that are involved. And currently, our index is growing. We have about 13,000 organizations in particular inside our knowledge graph. And so obviously some of those are data repositories, and so these recommendations are of interest to us. So Ocean Info Hub is really following the data on the web best practices guidance of the W3C. We're working with our partners to express their metadata using schema.org, serialized in JSON LD. That JSON LD then is made available on the web, following web architectural practices, which means that we can then harvest that information using standard web architecture and form a knowledge graph out of that. In that context, then, what I did was simply take the recommendations from the working group and see how well they align with schema.org, in particular type organization, which is what we're using for institutions. And they align quite well to the work that we're already doing, but also just to the schema.org type organization in general. Many of them have direct correlations. You'll see, language, institution, contact information, name, description, all these types of things. There are a set of them which do not align particularly well in schema.org, and I use this kind of publishing principles as my go-to to just address those, right? Because this was really just a zeroth order, quick, how can I represent this in schema.org? And so I used publishing principles as a way to kind of say, well, for things like terms of deposit or terms of access, these could be documents or web pages that describe that. I can provide a link and a description of that utilizing this kind of publishing principles property types that are associated with that property. But overall, the alignment of the recommendations of the working group in schema.org was rather simple. And I think with some review from a community, one could hone in on how to represent more canonically some of these other properties as well. Part of that is due to the kind of loose semantics of schema.org, which is probably a virtue, not a vice, allowing that type of implementation to take place. Because of that, you could see different interpretations of how to represent this in schema.org. And so there might be some alignment issues that take place later on, even though you're using the same vocabulary to do that. But reality, once you've gotten that far, you're really ahead of the game, I think, in that regard. So overall, implementation of the working group recommendations in schema.org is completely doable and rather easy. I went on then and said, okay, well, based on that initial implementation document, let's create a validation document. And this is one of the nice things that you could see coming out of working groups like this, that the ways to express their recommendations as a validation document. These might be things like XSD, there might be JSON schema, shackle checks, things like that. because I'm working in a RDF environment with schema.org and JSON-LD, I chose Shackle, created a Shackle shape, and then did tests against my implementation. And I could easily validate it, or in the case you see in the background here, make errors in my validation and get then a report back. And this is one of the nice things, right? Because it allows a group, a working group, making recommendations like this to say, let's address issues of, say, cardinality, or issues of types, or things like this. How do we really want dates to be expressed, for example, or spatial locations to be expressed? And a person can get as constraining or as loose as one wants then in that type of a situation. And the other nice thing is that this means that as part of the process that Ocean Info Hub is doing, we are doing reports back to our partners and how well they're aligned to certain things, whether it's spatial, temporal, whether it's provenance or citation information. And recommendations like these from a working group could be just simply one more check that we could place into our workflow and say, look, for type organizations that are data repositories, this is how well you align with the recommendations from this working group. And you could also go through then in Shackle and associate different severity levels. So there's 3 different severity levels that are available inside a validation like this. I noticed there was 3 different levels in kind of the gap analysis that was done, and those easily mapped then when I did that inside the validation, that's easily mapped into the severity levels inside Shackle. The upshot is that, again, this is a situation where these recommendations can be implemented both for representation, but also for validation as well. So in conclusion, overall, implementing this in a structured environment like schema.org is completely doable. Once you do that, what you have available to you is a machine readable representation that can be published in a web architectural environment, and that opens up those resources for multiple users, right? So not only could Ocean Info Hub harvest that, but Google could harvest that. Other organizations following this could do it. An organization focused specifically on data repositories could use that as a way to collect that information and form a knowledge graph from that. And one of the nice things then too is that as more of these knowledge graphs are getting developed and we want to do integration across the knowledge graphs, recommendations like this can be incredibly important for addressing not only the F in FAIR, but also the interoperability aspect of FAIR as well as the access to web architecture and these types of things. So very nicely aligned with FAIR approaches in terms of implementing these recommendations in this type of web architectural environment. And just you can kind of see some of the Go FAIR implementation network concepts of fostering, implementing, and communicating, and how those play out in an ecosystem like this. So overall, it was a really nice experience to work with these, both from an implementation and validation standpoint. And I appreciate your time.
Great. Join me in thanking all 3 of our Lightning Talk presenters. And if we could return to the slides. Oh, perfect. All right, so we're going to move to the interactive part, and it's going to be a little bit of a challenge in this room. I think what we'll do is we'll have 4 breakout groups in the conference venue here. And then Matt, if you and Lindsay could facilitate online discussion. And then in the booth, if you could please mute the Zoom so that those guys can talk and we're not hearing them over the speakers, that would be great. So we're going to be tight on time. What we want to do in these quick small group discussions is try to generate as many ideas as possible answering these 2 questions. So who are potential adopters for the data repository attributes and how do we engage them? And then understanding that the group is concluding, what next steps would you like to see the group do as we wrap up our charge? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask, I'm going to put Hagar and Adam together. And Adam, if you could stand up and wave over there, and Hagar, if you could join him. So maybe roughly 1/4 of the people kind of gravitate towards Adam. And then for the next group, Luca, if you can wave. Also gravitate towards Luca. Again, the room isn't good for it. Everybody has to stand up and you have to move to these people. So please be mobile. For the third group will be my colleague Nina. Nina, stand up and wave. And then for the fourth group will be with Mike Pretty. Mike, if you can wave. Also in the back there, Luca, maybe you, yeah, shunt over. Okay. And so please, everybody, take this opportunity to stretch and to move to one of the four quarters of the room. And so what we'll do is we'll do some brainstorming and some quick small group discussion on these two questions. And we'll go until, let's say, quarter after, okay? So just over 20 minutes. So again, the idea is not to get stuck on any one idea, it's just to generate as many ideas as you can. And then facilitators, if you can help get those ideas into the Google Doc. And then what we'll do at quarter after is we'll come back together and then I'll ask the facilitators just to do a very quick, 2-minute report out, okay? So we'll move into a small group discussion then. And again, please don't sit off by yourself. Join one of our 4 colleagues here in the room and then go ahead and get started online, Matt.
Hi. So yeah, I hope everyone in the room in Zoom can hear me, and I hope they can't hear us in the room there.
Yeah, that would
So,
be
yeah.
super, super horrible if we were booming through the entire huge lecture hall.
I know. I think we would be able to tell from Michael's reaction if they could hear us. So I think we're safe. So yeah, good to see some familiar faces from people who've been coming to the regular meetings and lots of new faces as well. So thanks for joining us. Yeah, I hope that presentation was useful and it was good to hear the case studies. You should still be able to see the questions on the slide, and I've copied them into the chat as well. So at this point, we've got 20 minutes and a couple of questions to consider. So who would be potential adopters and how can we engage them? I think if we just tackle that one for a few minutes, and then we can move on. So has anybody got any ideas or any questions or initial thoughts based on those questions? I'll do my best to write them down.
I could go. This is Ishwar here from the NIH. I think a low-hanging fruit in terms of potential adopters are several of our repositories that we are working with, and we have listed as potential sources to go to and share NIH-funded data. And in fact, we've been doing some exercises where it's been so hard to kind of even have a listing of names and URLs. So this would be a fantastic exercise to encourage them to consider and make it consistent. Jenny, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, what you're saying. So I guess I would flip it around, Matt. Who are not the potential adopters? I mean, why should every data resource not adopt this?
Oh, yes. I mean, that goes, but I'm just saying, how do we influence people and kind of encourage? So that's kind of how I was thinking. Yeah, I agree with you. Everybody should consider it. So.
Yeah, I think that's the point. I think we want everybody to adopt it, but how do we go after the most influential groups?
Yeah.
How do we make progress on this, really? Like, I think we all agree this is good because we've been looking at it for a few months now. And so, yeah, it's then thinking about what do we do next? How do we go after the groups that are going to make the biggest difference? And yeah, I guess
So if I can then dive in, thank you for narrowing that. Maybe one aspect of this is I was listening to the sort of examples, and one of the things I was learning from that is even in very well designed, thoughtfully run repositories, even then it was sometimes a bit of a challenge finding this information. It was scattered all over. So if I take that back a step, maybe what this informs is not just individual repositories, but basic design or architecture. And if you think about it that way, at least one of the presentations was institutional repository built on one of the General's repository frameworks. So maybe an easy way of doing that would be to get commonly used infrastructure frameworks for repositories to buy in and make it easy to have this information easily accessible or all in one place or something, because then you might get the most number of repositories bang for the buck. And then people, repositories who aren't part of that might see the sort of wave moving along and might choose to join in rather than doing a batch of one-offs. Just a thought.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. So yeah, I've made a note, like Dataverse, Figshare, some of the big companies that provide lots of separate kind of iterations for different institutions might be a good way to go. That's a good idea. We've got quite a few people with their hands up. Lauren, I think you were first.
Sure. Yeah. So I think to add on to that, you know, to go to fairsharing.org and R3 Data to see if they will implement this. And then I think part of the problem is that a lot of repositories are just not listed anyplace. And those are the repositories that need the most help. So I think thinking about like what ODIS, the Ocean Data Information System, has done, they've thought about, okay, what is the community that we're trying to reach, and then like tried to enrich metadata related to those repositories, and then engage the different repositories with their metadata so that they can correct the information on the web so that the ODIS has the correct metadata in place. So I think ultimately some kind of strategy like that would be needed, but going through R3 Data and fair sharing, and then also funders is great.
Yeah, so I think you've been coming to the meetings, but obviously we have Michael representing V3 Data and Alison representing Fair Sharing. So we have co-chairs for this group from those repository catalogs. So I think, yeah, that's definitely part of the plans. Yeah, feel free to make a point about the metadata in the notes as well, if you'd like to add that specifically, the point that you've made. Leighton, I think you are next.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate that. So as a group to reach out to, I serve as one of the federal employees on the call. I serve on the subcommittee of open science out of the OSTP. That's the group. I was one of the 50 authors of the desirable characteristics of data repositories that came out in 2022. A lot of the recommendations out of this particular group mesh well with those recommendations. And so we could, you know, we're thinking always of how do we update those desirable characteristics, pointing to this output as one of those updates in a future version would be one of those things. I'm happy to make a connection with folks from this group and the appropriate folks at SOS so that we can get in front of the committee for a meeting and present on this when it's finalized. And then, not to prefigure a little bit, but yeah, one of the next steps I'd like to see is include recommendations for how we, but to follow up on Jenny's comment, how do we update or fix our repository interfaces to make this information more easily findable? Is it enough to have it registered in V3 Data or Fair Sharing and then simply have that link on the homepage? Or is there something more that needs to be done at the more base level of the way our repository is split? Sorry to jump ahead.
No, that's really useful. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm sure we'd be delighted if this were to be, the attributes were to be used by OSTP in a future version of those characteristics. So that sounds great. Yeah, happy to chat further. Lindsay.
Yeah, I think in general, just having really well established repositories across domains, you know, getting people together that actually know these, can put them together quickly, and then having them provide like a cross checklist of what they have, I think would just be a easy low hanging fruit start, honestly.
So do you mean, Lindsay, like the repositories making available the information that they have?
I think
That
having the
perks these?
repository, yeah, like going through the checklist themselves and saying, hey, we provide all these things, and then whether it's clear or not to the users, could provide links to those things, you know, like an active working checklist example, you know, so it might be a way to improve their own information at their repository, but it would be really interesting, right? So really well-known repositories that everyone uses, if they just showed this is how we comply, here's a link, that would be interesting. And then if that was populated in a place maybe similar to wherever these documents are, then that would be an application example and not just use case, right? That would be, this is ongoing, this is funded, this is continuous kind of a thing, unless someone already said that.
I think that sounds good. Yeah, I think it's really interesting what Duerta was saying, like some repositories with in-house staff feel like they're being really diligent by providing 20 odd pages of guidance, but actually that ends up being unhelpful because the really key information is diluted across lots of different places and lots of different pages. So it's hard to find. And the only reason they were able to go through and find the things is because they knew it was there. A user might not be so diligent. Ishwar, yeah, you had another point.
Yep. So another community that we could potentially reach out to is the Global Biodata Coalition community. And the set of core resources from Elixir, they have considered group efforts. And so this could be kind of reached out to them to kind of implement and adopt. And as I hear everyone talking, I see that we're kind of formulating some kind of who to reach out to as part of a larger outreach plan, which was something I think Jenny alluded to in the last meeting we had, is what are the plans to kind of do an outreach and disseminate, and maybe putting together a systematic outreach plan would be something that this group could do as part of that second question that Michael posed to us for the breakout.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good point to kind of shift to the second question, given we've got about another 10 minutes. So yeah, are there other things that people think we should be trying to do next based on this? Feel free to keep adding other points in the notes if you want to. But yeah, maybe if we move on to thinking about that second question now.
So this is Jenny. Nature abhors a vacuum, so I'll talk. Machine readability.
Yeah, we've definitely talked a bit about that in the monthly group meetings, and obviously like the fact that the answer to these questions shouldn't just be human readable, but need to be machine readable too. Have you got ideas about what we should do to increase the machine readability of these answers?
I think others in the group are probably better than I am at answering that, but look, my mind instantly goes to aligning with schema.org or something like that.
So Matt, just a thought there is the 3 lightning examples that we saw took very different approaches for doing even that self-assessment. And so trying to share different approaches of doing that self-assessment and the level of stringency, I think I also saw different levels of strictness in each of these self-assessments. So I think trying to set some level plane over there could help repositories do it more easily, or do a more kind of a consistent job of even doing that self-assessment.
Yeah, I
and
guess.
and allowing for the discoverability of this. So I think one thing is the self-assessment and making sure that these elements exist, but the other thing is for others to discover that also. So I think increasing that discoverability and making it easier, because in the Dataverse example, the repository manager described that she knew it and she knew exactly where to go and the hundreds of pages of documentation, but others are not going to be able to do that, or even if they do that, might not find it. So how do we increase the discoverability of these attributes, even if not everything? So
Yeah, definitely. I think the point about consistency is really interesting. Like I think, yeah, it's really interesting to see how the three different people looking at their own repositories did it in a really different way. But yeah, I don't know. I'd be interesting to think about whether people feel like we can allow people to do it in their own way, or whether we need people to be following a strict, more similar process. And I guess if we do want more similarity, we probably need to give guidance on that, right? Like, yeah. I think giving them just the 18 questions to answer, by giving it to 3 people, we've shown that you can get as many different ways of answering those questions. And if we do want people to be more specific, then we probably need to give them more guidance.
Yeah, I think it's fine to have some level of different approaches, but at least some benchmarks of consistency of when you say it does exist or doesn't exist, and then what kind of when do you say that?
Please wrap up your conversations, get your last ideas into the Google Doc. Sorry to cut it short, but.
Okay. Sounds like we're wrapping up. Thank you for Lauren. Do you want to go quickly whilst they're just finishing up?
Sure. Yeah, I think this has to be machine actionable. So Otis, so Doug Fells led the work with Otis, where they use schema.org and JSON-LD, like you talked about, and developed a knowledge graph where it's federated metadata. So it's not a repository telling you, oh, these are my attributes. It's that the metadata are machine readable. And then if they want to change the machine readable metadata such that the metadata reflects what they think it should, then they do that. And so I think that's really the only way to approach this, because like a self-designation, A, it's not going to really capture changes over time, and B, that's not fair. So I think that would be the best approach.
So if the breakout leaders could come up to the dais here, we'll do quick reports out, just a couple minutes from each group. Matt online, perhaps you can go first if your group is wrapped up.
Yep. Can you hear me, Michael? Yep. Can you hear me?
Yes, we've got sound in the room.
Okay.
So people are turning chairs around here and just getting settled in. If you could do just a couple minutes of a recap of your discussion in the online breakout group. Go ahead, Matt.
Thanks, Michael. So yeah, we had a good discussion, got a good group here online today. So we had thinking about potential adopters. We felt there was potential amongst the NIH and their different repositories. But then we went to think about how we could identify the most relevant groups. And we were inspired by what Duerta was saying, thinking that there might be a few key companies or distributors that provide infrastructure for lots of different institutional repositories like Dataverse and Figshare, and they could be good places to go to kind of affect get lots more coverage more quickly. We also had a member of the group who's been involved in the OSTP subcommittee for the desirable characteristics for data repositories. We felt there was potential that our work could align more closely in the future. And we also had some suggestions that there might be some data stewards groups that we could get involved as kind of a pool of people that could go out to their own repositories and take that forward. And the Global Biodata Coalition could be another good group to contact and advocate for the work that we've been doing. Then thinking about next steps, there was a discussion about whether we needed some sort of systematic outreach plan, whether there should be suggestions for specific places to display the answers to these questions for specific repositories. We agreed that there should be a focus on machine readability for this, not just human readable answers. And then we were finished up with a bit of a discussion around the fact that the 3 presentations we had all showed slightly different ways of answering the questions, and whether that's okay. And it's okay to see kind of a variation in how people tackle the answers to the 18 variables, or whether we need to try and push for a more specific process for people to go through when they're creating their answers, so we have more consistency in the way that people respond and people kind of provide this information about their repository. So yeah, that was where we got to.
Great, thanks, Matt. That was a terrific wrap up. Round of applause for the online group. And I think Adam and Hagar will go to you next in the room mic. If we could turn that on.
Oh, do I turn it on? It's on? Fantastic.
Good.
So lots of discussion, which kind of boiled down to kind of a few clear ideas about where we're going with it. So when we're talking about adopters, we were discussing researchers who had a requirement to deposit in a trusted repository were an obvious audience for this, as well as repository managers or people building new repositories that, due to the similarities to or the parallels with Core Trust Seal, this would provide a great framework for people developing a repository to align to this set of attributes and use it as a roadmap. So we also talked about institutional research data managers as an important group to target, as well as national level research data professional networks. So moving beyond those groups to discussing engagement, I think the group felt that it would be very important to engage with national organizations involved in the evaluation of research to try to get them to act as advocates for the attributes. And so in terms of next steps, I think the group thought it was very, very important, or no, it would be a good next phase of development to provide information and recommendations about how to provide the attributes in machine readable or machine actionable format. They also felt it was very important to map these attributes to registries, and I think the group was interested to know to what extent these were already available in research data repository registries. The group also asked whether we could just make them mandatory. And then beyond just asking repositories to make the information and the attributes available, an important next phase would be to ensure that when information was available, it was kind of a useful and usable tool, so we could also report on the quality of the information shared about each of the attributes. And that was it.
Great, thank you. If we could go to Luca and then Nina, if you want to come up also, the queue. Or yeah, use the mic there, that's fine.
So thank you very much to the group. There were lots of ideas that were generated, lots of examples that we started with that made us come to a conclusion that any kind of repository can benefit from being made aware of these characteristics and implementing them. The examples that were quoted were, this is kind of a bulleted list, member repositories of World Data System, registries like Fair Sharing and Read3 Data, institutions that don't have the repository yet, but they're looking around, and so they can see what is needed. There was an example for the University of Graz here in Austria. About the NIH, they have numerous data repositories, and in that case, a federated approach could definitely use a list like this one. And also the emerging list of repositories that are considered suitable by the NIH can use these recommendations. And it's both for the institutions to find out what is needed and for the researchers to see how they can structure what they're looking for. The RDA funders group could be also beneficiary of this, and also organizations that identify themselves as GLAM, so gallery, libraries, archives, and museums. A note about the examples that were presented, which were great. And an exercise like that, the recommendation would be for not to review and analyze your own repository and ask somebody else to do that for you. The second question, next steps that are recommended. There was consensus on needing to have a standardized view to represent the information. And if implementation is done through schema.org, it would be ideal, straightforward. And also a need to get some metrics on the usage. The International Science Council and their affiliate members could be also a good target to disseminate the work that's been done. And next steps also would be to give the information to the people that generate the data. And there was suggestion that often the repository administrators themselves don't have much success, but the example was about the Austria Rectorate Conference. If it comes from the Rectorate, then there would be more success in adoption. There's a need for implementation guidance, recommendations on how to implement these characteristics, and some feedback and evaluation on the usage. Finally, reaching out through certifying bodies like Quatrasil would be a good idea. So there's a confirmation of the recommendations. And that is it.
Great, thank you, Luca. And thanks for helping keep us on time here. I know we're a little bit pressed. So now, Nina, your group.
Yeah, so we started to talk about, or to actually differentiate a bit what kinds of adoption there are, because there's like lots of different types of adoption. And obviously there are two sides. So you have the implementation of the attributes, that would be the repositories. And of course you have the users of such information that can be a broad range. And mainly we discussed, for example, registries or catalogs, but of course this can also be end users like researchers or individual librarians. And yeah, the next steps we discussed were that it would make sense to target groups or communities of repositories. So if we want to establish the attributes and we want to make them known to as many repositories as possible, it will save some time probably to reach out to groups. Then also provide best practices for the repositories on how to expose such attributes. So for example, how to use schema.org, or also how to build this information into repository software to make it machine readable. We discussed that the repositories themselves should actually be like the source of truth for this information, because if you provide it to lots of different places, there might be changes. So it should be possible to go back to the repository to export the information. And that's why it's so important to have it in a machine readable format. And then the group, the DROG, could continue to help repositories by defining controlled vocabularies for some of these attributes. I think this would be also, would make it easier. And to provide guidance, for example, we've seen it in one of these talks today, that it makes a big difference who checks on the attributes. So there should be some guidance on how the attributes are collected by the repositories. And we agreed that this could also be made much easier if there's some sort of automatization process. I think we've already discussed this. But then some attributes might not be as easily, maybe like automatically exportable. So that has to be looked into. And there was the idea to build crosswalks also to groups like schema.org, to fair sharing and re3 data, to make sure that they also implement them in their schema as far as possible, and provide some guidance if there's, for example, different types of data within a repository. So how do you, if they have like, if the attributes would look differently for these different types of data, this should be solved. Yes, and also the question how to show this information to the end users. So we have talked a lot about more of the infrastructure perspective, but I think it's important also to look on the individual perspective of the end users.
Thanks, Nina. And also, you guys win the Golden Chair Award for thinking to turn your row of chairs around and work with the room. So thanks for that. So our last group, Mike in the back. In the room, Mike.
One of the advantages of going last is I don't have any notes, but I don't have to talk too much because we've covered pretty much a similar set of discussions and a similar set of key stakeholders, for instance, Court-SCL and registries, etc. But there's one or two other interesting areas that came up that we're not just looking at data repositories. We could apply this to others like software repositories, like a semantic artifact, catalogs, etc. But also beyond the research space as well. This may be of interest to communities outside. In Europe, we also have these other data spaces, which means things like governmental data, etc. This could be an interesting crossover area to make sure that they are talking the same way and talking about the same things as we are here. So it could be useful to go beyond the very basic stuff of, we know about research data and data repositories, but there are others things that are out there as well. And of course, we've talked about registries like re3data, and obviously the fact that the repositories are responsible for putting this information out there. So it's very similar to all the other groups so far. So, and of course, one of the key things is talking about transparency and trust. So those are the very important aspects of that. And I will say, I also have a poster tomorrow, particularly on that topic of transparency of trust.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to your group. So thank you all for working with the room, and it's kind of awkward and with the time constraints. I know that having just 25 minutes to answer two big questions like this, you feel very, very constrained, but we really got a lot of good ideas in a short period of time. So what I want to do is wrap up with next steps for the DROG. And so a couple of things. One thing that occurred to me is that we had 7 of our members of our group went through the exercise like the lightning talks, where they examined their own data repositories and tried to ascertain the attributes. And we had a template and a document, and we shared these among our subgroup. And there were two kind of overarching themes. One was that this was a really helpful exercise, even for repository managers who knew their data repository very well. They gained some insights and they learned from the process. The second theme was that nobody was ready to share their example yet, because they felt like, well, maybe we could share after we did these updates, right? Because there were some gaps. And so one thing that we may consider as a group, and the co-chairs will talk about, is rethinking having a supporting output that's like published and fixed. It may make more sense for us to include examples that are links to the wiki, where they can be dynamic and people will be more comfortable sharing them in that way. And so this is something to consider, and hopefully Tab will allow us to soften that output if we decide that's in our best interest. I wanted to also share that the co-chairs will be meeting in about 2 weeks. We'll be incorporating all the feedback we got from this session. We'll be wrapping things up and submitting the output for community review. And so after a period of time, the RDA community will have the opportunity to weigh in on the output and make comments, and then we'll have one last opportunity to make revisions before hopefully it's approved and it's published by the group. And then this is a new experience to me. I've never concluded a working group in RDA before. Rosella was on our last call and she kind of talked us through the options. So, I mean, option number 1 is just poof, we're done, we no longer exist and that's it. Not a very good option. Option number 2 is that the working group goes into a maintenance mode. This requires at least one implementer and someone who is named as a maintainer. And so this is probably the most likely outcome for us, but we're open to input on this. Other options include spawning a new working group. If our work revealed new requirements and new things that we wanted to create as an output, we could create a new working group and work on them. The other is to hand off the output to an existing interest group within RDA, or conceivably spawn a new interest group. So these are kind of the options that are in front of us. Like I say, I think that probably the option we're leaning towards is maintenance mode. But if you have some kind of input or other ideas, we're open to them. In maintenance mode, basically what we'll do is if the output is approved and published, we'll see the recommendation through the review process. We'll work to facilitate adoption and implementation, and then we'll steward the output, which means that we're allowed to update it over time, but that we would not take on any additional significant work. If we were to do that, then in theory, we should write a new case statement and become a new working group. So thumbs up, do I have that right, Rosella? Perfect, perfect. Thanks for your expert guidance. And so this brings us to a conclusion for the RDA DROG after about 2 years of work. I want to thank everybody for attending today, both online and here in person. I also want to acknowledge our co-chairs, Matt Cannon, who has been facilitating online from Taylor and Francis, Allison Lister from fairsharing.org, Washington Segundo, Kathleen Shearer from CORE, myself, and Kazu Yamaji from the NII in Tokyo. And then, of course, you know, all of you for participating. This is cheers from our last 19th meeting of the Data Repository Attributes Working Group. Congratulations for completing this work, and thank you all for your contributions to it. Enjoy the rest of International Data Week, and stay tuned on our next steps for our working group. Thank you.